Hey guys, so I'm back at it with another analytical video where I assess deck performance by simulating thousands of opening hands and outline the proportion of times I bring out certain monsters or have certain number of interruptions. Now for this video, we're going to take a look at Cyber Dragons with Red Eyes Dark Dragoon based on my most recent list that you see here. And we'll be doing a simulation of when we go second as usual, but also what the numbers are like when we are forced to go first. And shout out to commenter Gel625 for giving me this idea. Now if your list is similar to mine, running a no dupe variant with similar ratios of hand traps, back row hate, and the like, then the numbers you see in this video will probably be similar to your list as well. So I always like doing these simulations just to get a solid quantitative understanding of my deck, especially now that with Dragoon the deck's capability has changed quite a lot. Now, if you like these analytical videos, then consider liking the video and subscribing so that I know that you want more. Now, unlike my previous videos where I categorize each hand as great, good, bad, or a brick based on a set criteria, I decided not to do this for this video because now with Dragoon in the mix, the criteria of what would be considered as great or good hand, for example, would change a lot and of course very subjective. And I didn't want people focusing on trying to compare the values from previous videos because the definitions will be different, other than maybe the proportion of brick hands because the definition of that has been the same. So instead, I'm going to be providing you with the percentage of times that we bring out Infinity and Dragoon, or just Dragoon, along with the different number of usable interruptions, and provide a general descriptive overview. And this will make more sense once you watch the rest of the video. Now for those of you who are new to watching these analytical videos, let me quickly provide a description of what I mean by usable interruptions. Basically this includes cards like hand traps, back row hate, kaiju, and while I don't have them in my deck currently, also cards like mind control or Pankratops, just generic disruption cards that you would be using in a duel. And the reason why I emphasize that I'm looking at the number of usable interruptions is that in situations like when you have 2 Ghost Ogres in your hand and an Ash in your opening hand of 5 cards, and you draw an effect veiler as your 6th draw, even though that's a total of 4 interruption cards that you have, only 2 were considered usable, right? The 1 Ogre and the Ash, because Ghost Ogre is once per turn, so you can only use one of the 2, and you drew the veiler as your 6th draw, which is dead, and you weren't able to use it while your opponent was doing their combos. So keep that in mind as you look at the results. Now for the first simulation where we're assuming we're going second and having 6 cards in hand, we're assuming that our opponent won't have any hand traps or negate to disrupt our plays of bringing out Infinity or Dragoon, because while not realistic, it just helps keep measures consistent. We're also assuming that our opponent will have a monster on board so that we can special summon Cyber Dragon, but not going to assume that they have a monster in the extra monster zone because sometimes contact fusing away our Cyber Dragon to make our repair plant live as our only good play can come up, and I don't want to assume that everything is in the optimal situation for us. Also, in cases where we can only summon Infinity or Dragoon, but not both, then we're going to prioritize bringing out Dragoon just for the sake of this analysis. We already know from my previous video how often we can bring out Infinity, so for this analysis we're going to see how often we can bring out Dragoon, if that's our priority. Lastly, in cases where we hard draw Red Eyes Fusion, we will again have the assumption that we will prioritize using this card first and bring out Dragoon, which means we can't summon any other monsters that turn. This also means that if we had a kaiju in hand, when we hard draw Red Eyes Fusion, the kaiju will now be considered as a dead card and not be counted towards the number of usable interruptions. Now I know that not in all cases we would use the Red Eyes Fusion that we hard drew, because sometimes we may have the hand to OTK anyway, so we decide to do our normal Cyber Dragon plays. But again, just to make things consistent and simplistic as possible, we're going to assume that we will just resolve Red Eyes Fusion if we draw it. As for the coding for this simulation, I stopped showing the coding in my videos because I figure that's pretty boring, so make sure to check out my previous analytical videos if you wanted to take a glimpse at that. Alright, so on to the results. First, when going second, we had the hand to bring out Infinity and Dragoon 52% of the time with my list. This of course means that we didn't hard draw the Red Eyes Fusion in these situations because otherwise you wouldn't have been able to summon any other monsters. Now we were able to bring out Dragoon, whether with or without Infinity, almost 93% of the time, which shouldn't be that surprising considering that any 2 effect monsters equal Anaconda, and this brings out Dragoon. And this also includes instances where we hard draw Red Eyes Fusion as well. Lastly, we couldn't bring out Infinity or Dragoon 7.5% of the time, in most instances because we just drew too many interruption cards instead. Now I decided to at least bring you guys the proportion of what I consider a brick hand, and this is when you have 0 hand traps in your starting hand of 5 cards as your opponent is going off, and also not having any board wipe cards like Lightning Storm in your opening hand of 6 cards as you start your turn going second, on top of not being able to bring out Infinity or Dragoon, and also not even having access to summon out Core for the current or subsequent turn. So literally just like the worst hand, and this happened 0.4% of the time out of 100,000 trials. Now let's look at the number of usable interruptions that we had. So we had absolutely 0 usable interruptions just under 8% of the time, but 64% of the time we had at least 2 usable interruptions. And if we delve a little further, in instances where we had the hand to bring out Infinity and Dragoon, we also had at least 1 usable interruption on top of that, about 47% of the time out of 100,000 hands. Lastly, I wanted to look at the number of usable interruptions I had available in instances where I hard drew the Red Eyes Fusion. So hard drawing Red Eyes Fusion occurred 14,279 times, which is just in line with what you get out of a hypergeometric calculator, where drawing a 1 of in a 42 card deck in an opening hand of 6 should happen about 14.29% of the time. Anyways, in instances where we hard drew the Red Eyes Fusion, we had at least 2 usable interruptions 46% of the time. And remember, when we hard drew the Red Eyes Fusion, the kaijus are no longer considered as usable interruptions because we can't summon any monsters that turn, we use that fusion spell, so these numbers take that into account. Alright then, so now let's do the simulation of 100,000 opening hands again, but this time pretend that we are forced to go first for game 1. In terms of assumptions, mostly the same as before, except that our opponent will now not have a monster board, obviously since we're the one going first, and we would also have 5 cards instead of 6 in our opening hand. Now, Cybernetic Overflow will be considered as a usable interruption now, whereas it was considered as a dead card in my previous analysis when we were going second. Lastly, cards that you can only use going second, like Lightning Storms, Feather Duster, Kaijus, they will be considered as dead cards when going first and will not be counted towards the usable interruption count. But hand traps will still be considered as usable interruptions because you can still use them when your opponent starts their turn when they go second. Okay, with those assumptions out of the way, let's look at the numbers for the same scenarios that I covered earlier, but this time under the condition that we went first. So, we were able to bring out Infinity and Dragoon 39% of the time when forced to go first, and could bring out at least Dragoon 83% of the time. These numbers are lower of course because we now are dealing with just 5 cards instead of 6, not to mention we don't get that free special summon off of Cyber Dragon because we are going first. And we were unable to bring out either Infinity or Dragoon 17% of the time when forced to go first, which is a bit higher than I'd like to see. Next, let's cover the proportion of brick hands when going first. This definition is a little different here because we don't specifically consider board wipe cards since we can't use them going first. So in general, we're just looking at whether we had 0 usable interruptions going first, on top of not summoning out Infinity and Dragoon and not having access to Core. This happened 1% of the time when forced to go first. In terms of usable interruptions, when forced to go first we had at least 2 usable interruptions 39% of the time. Now keep in mind that I decided to consider Gamma as a usable interruption even when going first for a couple of reasons. I mean, I get that if you have a monster on board then you can't use Gamma anymore, but you may not play Gamma in your list but instead something like Ghost Ogre or Veiler, so I wanted these numbers to be somewhat transferable to other players' decks. Also, technically during your opponent's turn, maybe they get rid of your monsters and as they continue to go off, you can now resolve the Gamma, so that's why I still counted them and I didn't want to be too specific to Gamma's conditions. Anyways, again, if we delve a little further, we had the hand to bring out Infinity and Dragoon, and on top of that, have at least 1 usable interruption 35% out of 100,000 hands when forced to go first. Lastly, if we hard drew the Red Eyes Fusion when going first, we had at least 2 usable interruptions 22.5% of the time. Alright guys, so I know that's a lot of data that you just saw, so feel free to kind of pause it at different moments and take a further look. Again, I use these simulations just to get a better understanding of my deck and kind of see what kind of build I prefer. For example, the machine duplication variant will of course be able to bring out Infinity and Dragoon more often, as well as enabling OTKs easier. But right now in this format, I wanted to play more hand traps, so I was willing to give up on that boost and stick with more interruption cards instead. But of course, ultimately you should play your deck in the ratios that you feel most comfortable rather than solely relying on the numbers. And I really like both the machine dupe and no dupe variants and will be flipping back and forth in between different formats. Anyways guys, hope you found this enjoyable and hope that it helped understand Cyber Dragons with Dragoon a little bit better. And that's it for me. Take care, guys.